Welcome back, everyone. We're now on our second topic for Unit 3. We're looking at painting. So there are a fair number of vocabulary terms that we want to be familiar with as relates to creating a painting and even to getting ready to start making a painting. So our first major terms to be aware of include the support, size, and ground. Those are all terms that relate to prepping the surface that you're going to make a painting on. Then we have terms including pigment, binder, and solvent. These are terms that relate to making the paint itself. And then we'll be looking at different types of paint. There are multiple different kinds of paints that are used by artists, and we're going to look at them pretty much in the order that they were developed and used historically. We'll start with one of the oldest forms in caustic, we'll move to fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor, gouache, and we'll end with acrylic, the most contemporary, newest type of paint that's been developed. So looking at the term support, your support is literally the thing you're painting on. Technically, the painting is somewhat protected from becoming a permanent part of the support. So the support you could imagine as being the thing the painting rests. And the support is either flexible or rigid. For a long time, the most common support was the rigid support, usually a wooden panel or a plaster wall or a cave wall in the case of our ancient prehistoric cave painters. Eventually, artists developed the use of flexible support, the primary one, of course, being canvas, and you're familiar with painting on canvas. Canvas paintings are much lighter, more easily transportable than the same sized paintings on heavy wooden panels. They're also less likely to warp or to crack, and the flexible support canvas can respond to changes in humidity and temperature and moisture in a way that wooden panel is just too rigid to do. Flexible support can also be removed from its stretcher system and rolled to make it easier to transport or to store. So there's a lot of advantages to working on a flexible support. Regardless of whether we're using a flexible or rigid support, though, we do want to protect the support itself from any negative effect from the paint. If you're painting in oil, for instance, we don't want the oil to seep into the canvas and cause the canvas to decay. So we seal the surface that we're painting on, and that's the term that we're looking at next, the term size. In this case has nothing at all to do with physical dimensions, how big the piece is. The size is the material that seals the surface. It's a glue that seals the surface. The traditional size is derived from boiling the skin. As gross as that may sound to us today, the traditional size is, in fact, rabbit skin glue. Once the support has been sealed with a size, we then apply another layer on top of the size. We refer to that as the ground, and that is going to act as another barrier to protect the support from the caustic effects of paint like oil, but it also creates a brilliant white surface to paint on. If you apply a bright color onto plain brown wood, the color won't be as bright as if it were applied on top of a piece of wood that had been painted white first. So the ground really acts as not only another barrier of protection, but it also is vital that it creates that brilliant white surface to paint on. The most commonly used ground is called gesso, traditionally made from plaster and chalk. Pigment is our first ingredient in making paint itself, and pigment is literally the colored material ground up into fine particles of dust that gives the paint its color. And that pigment can come from a number of different sources. They could be minerals, or they could be synthetic chemically created substitutes. We have a lot of pigments that we use today that we have synthetic substitutes for, because some pigments that have been in use in previous generations were discovered to be quite toxic. For instance, lead was used as the base for white paints, and of course lead is quite toxic if ingested or if it enters the human stream, and so it was definitely an artist's material that was quite hazardous and has now been replaced with a synthetic substitute. The itself is the coloring agent, but what makes the pigment stick both to itself and to the surface you're painting on is known as the binder. So when we're making paint, it really is the binder, the thing that binds it together, that determines what type of paint it is that you're using. The binder for oil paint, for instance, is linseed oil. Solvent is the opposite of your binder. You can think of this just like we use the term in a science lab or chemistry class. Solvent is what dissolves the paint. So the idea of the use of the solvent is to break the paint down. It's primarily really used for cleaning more than anything else. You can use it to thin the paint, but there are some problems associated with that. If you were to use only solvent in thinning the paint out, instead of getting an even wash effect, you would have separated small flecks and dots of paint, because really the solvent's main job is to break the paint down. So there are different ways of creating thin glazed layers that we'll look at. Again, your types of paint are encaustic, fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor, gouache, and acrylic, and we're going to look at each of those cases separately. You don't have to know all of the details of making brushes, but in general, we have brushes that are used made primarily from hog's hair. Generally, if you think of a wild boar having kind of a mohawk of bristles along its spine, are the bristles that are most commonly used. The hog's hair bristle brushes are used primarily for oil paint and encaustic. The general category we call sable brushes are used more for watercolor, although they can also be used for oil paint and egg tempera. But the sable brushes I tend to think of, and sable is kind of a nice way of labeling the types of animals whose hairs are used for these brushes, but sable really could mean mink or ermine or weasel. They're usually harvested from the tip of the tail. We also have synthetic brushes that are good for acrylic paints, and I wanted you to see some different types of brushes. At the top you have what we refer to as a bright. It is a brush that is flat on its tip, but has curvature in the bristle as it meets that tip. The fan looks kind of like a makeup brush, although it is essentially flat in this direction. The filbert has straight sides, comes to a tip, so it allows for little fine detail. The three parts of the brush, obviously the handle, the bristles, the hair, the metal bit in the middle is known as the ferrule, and the ferrule is crimped on one end to hold the bristles in place, and crimped usually at least once, but the more crimp you have here, the better. The crimping here is to allow it to attach to the wooden handle as firmly as possible. The types of paintbrushes that we use most frequently in the studio on campus are flats and rounds, and the brushes themselves come into sizes. A size 1 is the very small size, a size 12 is our largest. So the flat brushes have essentially flat sides and flat tips. The rounds are in this direction like a cylinder, and they come to a round tip here as well. Your watercolors usually are much smaller, and you can see that they are a reddish color. That's our sable hair brush. We use this type of brush that has a very, very long bristle for doing really fine lines, and these larger ones are often called mops for doing large areas. Generally speaking, whether you're using a brush or painting with another tool, we use the painting knife, sometimes called the palette knife, for the actual mixing of the color. In fact, the training that I received really argued against mixing with the paintbrush on the canvas and really advocated for the idea of mixing very purely the color you wanted to use on what we call the palette, flat working surface for mixing paint. It could be wood or it could be glass. I've given you a basic layout here. I usually lay my colors out in essentially kind of a rainbow or spectrum, like our color wheel that we looked at, starting with my reds, ending with white, black, and my earth tone colors. And I've given you a list here of the colors that are most frequently used, especially in training artists. Our reds include a purplish red known as alizarin crimson, a more pure red like you expect to see in a box of crayons, cadmium red, to cadmium orange, cadmium yellow. Yellow ochre is usually a little darker, browner, a little more natural looking than bright yellow. Viridian green is kind of dark emerald green, more like what you might think of as Carolina blue. Cobalt and ultramarine get increasingly deep and dark. We often use dioxazine purple, which is a very, very dark purple. It has to be cut with a bit of white, usually, to make it workable. White and black, obviously, and then our two main categories for our earth brown colors include the siennas, number 13 on the chart, and umbers, number 14, both of which can be in either raw or burnt form. The burnt form just means that the pigment actually has been heated, and by heating it, it changes it, makes it a little bit darker. So the raw and burnt siennas tend more toward being an orange brown, and the raw and burnt umber tend toward more of a green brown. Our supports, that's definitely once we have decided we're going to make a painting, we have made a drawing probably to plan out what the image is going to look like. We're definitely then having to decide whether we're going to work on a rigid or a flexible support, and then, of course, decide what type of paint we're going to use. Rigid support example that you're seeing here is a commercially available masonite panel. Masonite is a replacement for some of the heavier wooden panels that people used in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. One of the advantages of masonite is that unlike a wooden panel that still shows wood grain, the way that masonite is made is that the wood is actually pulverized into essentially sawdust mixed with glue and extruded. Is no wood grain, which means that the material is less likely to split or crack along the grain. There's no knots. There's no surface texture to worry about either. So essentially the masonite is kind of a processed form of wood that allows us to have a stronger, less likely to warp, split, or crack surface that's also much, much thinner and a little bit easier to transport. Most people, though, who are making paintings will encounter at some point the need to make their own canvases when working with a flexible support. If you are purchasing pre-made canvases, that is a little bit of a false economy. The pre-stretched canvas is, relatively speaking, more expensive than stretching the canvas yourself. However, stretching canvas requires buying a lot of supplies initially at the outset. So when I set out to make a series of paintings, there's more of an expense at the beginning end of things, but I can make more canvases ultimately for that cost if I'm stretching them myself rather than buying pre-made. So to create or stretch a canvas, we need a couple of things. The stretcher bars that you see here that look kind of like a window frame, they are cut to a 45-degree angle, so they attach together to create 90-degree corners. You want your stretcher pliers, which help you grip the fabric. A staple gun, which is much easier than the traditional way of using a nail and a hammer. I usually do have a tack hammer, though, to help the staples really adhere well, and the canvas itself, which is cut to be larger than the size of the stretcher frame system. So here's my stretcher bars being put together. You can see that 45-degree angle pretty clearly, but you can also see that a tongue and groove design. So those two pieces will interlock together. You can get these in a wide variety of lengths and widths. So now that I've made my stretcher system, I need to cut the canvas, and you see here this is a bolt of raw canvas. I've cut the piece larger than the actual size of the working surface because I need to be able to grip that excess in order to stretch it. If the canvas isn't stretched, then it will kind of sag on that frame and you won't be able to apply the brush properly. You want it to have kind of a springy surface, almost like the top of a drum. To get to that level, we need to be able to use the stretcher pliers, which help us to the surface. And you can see that the texture of the pliers, where it's going to clamp down on the fabric, looks almost like the surface of a meat tenderizing mallet, like little teeth all over it. So here I am using the stretcher pliers to grip and pull on the fabric, and this is the basic way of stretching the canvas itself. Usually what we do is put a staple in the very center on each of the four sides, and then we start stretching and pulling on the canvas and adding more staples as we go to tighten it, working from the center to the outside corners on each of the four sides. But we need to make sure that we alternate those so that we're not doing all one side first. I'll give you a shot though of how challenging this can be. I'm using one hand to hold the stretcher pliers. I'm using the other hand to manipulate my. So you really have to be kind of ambidextrous to make this work. As we're stretching though, you can see I've added some dashed lines there that show you the tension from the staples that I've put in, and then the slack area of the fabric on the outside around it kind of forms a diamond there. So you can see that I'm still working from my center to the corners in making sure that there's even pressure or even tension all the way around. In order to achieve this, rather than doing all one side and then turning the canvas and doing all of the next, we actually rotate and put a couple of staples on one side and then rotate the canvas and put staples directly on the opposite, and then rotate it a quarter turn and then opposite sides there again. So you end up having to do kind of a complicated approach. There's my first staples, here's round 2, round 3. So you can see I'm working my way out to the outer corners. Here's the last one. And that way I have even stretched pressure across, or tension across that whole surface. So you can see here, completed the stretch, and on this one I'm almost done. You can see that I still have 3 or 4 to go to get to the corners on this side. And it really does change the appearance. You can see how slack this fabric is and how tight this is. To finish the corners, there's a special fold to learn to do so that the fold stays completely even along the edge and doesn't look like a big weird wad of fabric. But now that I've done that process, I would then seal the surface with a size, and once the size is dry, I would then apply my ground. Now, we have an acrylic version of gesso these days that will do both jobs. It acts both as the size and the ground, and that's what I'm going to apply here to these canvases. So on the left, you can see that that canvas looks much brighter white than the canvas on the right. I've applied the gesso to one and not to the other, just so you can see a difference in the color of the fabric itself. Generally, when we're applying the gesso, we want to try to make sure, because as the gesso starts to dry, it will also start to stretch the fabric a bit, that we apply it as evenly as possible. So I usually start by trying to make a big X from corner to corner so that I have equal tension. Then we apply the gesso in layers, usually applying all the brush strokes in one direction, say left to right, allow that to dry and apply the next layer from top to bottom. And we usually apply 2 or 3 coats at least. Pigment is the colored material that gives paint its color, and it is made from a variety of different sources but ground into a powder, which you can see here. And what makes the paint itself different, one paint type to another, is the type of binder that's used. So the binder is the thing to kind of key in on for purposes of the test. With encaustic paint, the binder is going to be beeswax, kind of like the wax in a colored candle. Encaustic paint is really bright, but it is, because it is wax, it has to be heated to make it liquid. Fresco painting is done directly on wet plaster. Traditionally, the true technique is the plaster technique. Fresco buono is our wet plaster. Tempera paint, the binder is egg yolk traditionally. Oil paint, the binder is linseed oil. Watercolor, the binder is gum arabic, which is like the sap or secretion from the acacia plant. Gouache is the same as watercolor. The difference that the watercolor is transparent, gouache has chalk added to make it opaque, and the binder in acrylic is acrylic resin. Paints themselves can be used to create a different variety of visual effects. This is the encaustic paint, and these examples come all the way from ancient Egypt when it was part of the Roman Empire. And so these are actually mummy cases, but instead of being done in what we're used to thinking of as the traditional Egyptian style, they look like Roman portraits. Well, they were Roman citizens, and of course the Roman art styles begin to affect the art making in the colonies of the Roman Empire, and that's precisely what you see here. So you can see that there's still some sort of traditional painting happening on mummy cases, but the portraits are replacing, increasingly during the Roman imperial period, replace the traditional form with what look like very sensitive, naturalistic looking portraits. These are done in encaustic, and encaustic paint is literally pigment suspended in wax. In order to work with this material, the wax has to be hot so that it's in a liquid state. As it cools, it becomes very, very hard, and in fact, it even bonds into the surface of the support it's painted on. Usually, encaustic is painted on very rigid supports, particularly wood panel, but it retains a really rich, bright, intense color for years. So you can clearly see that these examples from ancient Egypt are vibrant today as they were when they were new. Contemporary artists have increasingly started using encaustics. A lot of pop artists in the 60s used it, and it's fairly popular actually in the Wilmington art scene today. The way that we usually work with encaustic paint is to use the paints in small metal cups. Those cups are placed on heating plates like you might use at a buffet. And as the temperature is heated up, it keeps the paint liquid, and then it can be applied with a brush or even with a palette knife. These are works of a 20th century pop artist, Jasper Johns. His paintings have really bright, rich, intense color as a result of using encaustics. The fresco technique can be done in two different ways. The way that the Egyptians used it was to paint directly in tempera paint onto dry plaster surface, and that dry technique is known as fresco secco. Buon fresco, the true technique, comes to us from the Italian tradition, and the idea here is that plaster is applied to a wall, but before it is allowed to completely dry, the artist would paint onto that still somewhat wet plaster. And the advantage there is that the damp plaster, as it dries, will absorb the pigment, making the painting not so much paint on the wall as it is paint embedded into the wall. So it makes it far more permanent and less likely to be damaged. Now, that wasn't necessary in ancient Egypt because of the incredibly hot and dry climate. If you're in a climate like Italy, where there's much greater chance of rainfall and fluctuations in humidity and temperature, that if you've applied paint on top of it, could easily crack and flake the paint off. If you paint onto the wet plaster and allow the pigment to absorb into the wall, it's much less likely to dry or flake or crack in that kind of climate. So the Italians developed for us what they called buon fresco, or true fresco. Certainly one of the most famous fresco paintings is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, which took him 4 years to complete, just the ceiling portion itself. He came back about a decade and a half later to paint the Last Judgment altar wall. The ceiling is roughly 120 feet in length and about 50 feet in width, and that 50 feet is on a curved surface. And what you're seeing in the painting is what looks to be architecture is all trompe-l'oeil illusion. That's all paint. So he has created kind of the prototype of classical ceiling painting in this example. It's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. So how do you do it? Well, the first step really is planning out the design in what we call the cartoon. This has nothing to do with the comic books we were talking about in the previous lecture. For our purposes in painting, the term cartoon means a drawing done to scale to show the main lines and details of the design for specifically a fresco or a painting on canvas. So in this case, you isn't a perfect example of a cartoon because this is really a study of the anatomy of this figure's pose, but you get an idea from this example by Michelangelo of how you would do a drawing and then apply that drawing to the wall to give you a guide to paint from. That's what the cartoon is. We know that Michelangelo was kind of frustrated by doing this process of painting this ceiling. He preferred to work in sculpture and later in architecture. He thought of sculpture as being the most important human endeavor, art form wise, and he actually tried to get out of doing this commission. At one point he left and the Pope sent his armed guards to find Michelangelo and drag him back to complete the job. I also know that Michelangelo wrote some kind of funny poetry about how unpleasant the entire experience was. The poem has been translated multiple times, but basically has some really funny comments about how much pain he's in trying to work standing upright on a scaffolding. And the poem in this one has an illustration of him showing you how his tummy has become necessary. He needs to have gut to help balance himself out, and you can see him painting on the ceiling there. It's kind of funny. The way that the process would work, though, this illustration combines several steps in one, so this really couldn't all be happening simultaneously, but it gives you a good idea of how this would work. Here you see assistants applying the plaster to the wall, and they would really only apply the amount that you could do in one working session. Because to embed into the plaster, you wouldn't want to apply plaster to the entire ceiling because there's no way you could paint that much surface in one go. So you would really only apply the amount you expect to finish in a day. You can kind of see that here along the legs of this figure, where there's the raw wall and the plaster. Once the plaster has almost set, the cartoon, the drawing done to scale, is applied to the ceiling, and that's done in a really odd way. The drawing actually gets holes poked into it along all the main outlines and contours. And then you see this figure here is holding a fabric bag filled with charcoal dust, and he's smacking it against the paper, which is forcing some of the charcoal dust through those holes to leave a dotted line for the artist to follow. And you can see the result of it here at the top, these outlines and contours on the faces of these angels. That's what the cartoon is used for. So the cartoon is destroyed in the process of transferring the drawing to the ceiling. It gets holes poked in it, and then this charcoal dust smacked through it in a technique called pouncing. And you can see how that leaves charcoal smudges all over the whole thing. So not only does it have holes in it, it's got big black areas all over it. It's a destroyed piece of paper at the end. So we don't have a lot of examples of cartoons to look at because they were literally destroyed in the process of their use. Once the drawing is in place, the artist can start working, usually in tempera paint, directly onto the plaster, into the plaster wall. So if you look at a painting up close, a fresco in the true buon fresco technique, you can often find, and you can see it here, a line where one day's work ends and the next day's work begins. And if you really get good at looking at it, you can see that the artist has very carefully painted just a tiny bit of background around the outside of the figure. It would be much easier to fill a large area with a relatively flat color than it would be to model all this change in highlight, shadow, and contour. So you can see that the figures, the individual pieces of the figures, would be done usually as one focus. A larger area like the sky or the background could be a much larger section completed in a faster amount of time. We refer to this, the border, as showing what we call one day's work, or in the Italian, a giornata. Just for those who are interested, this diagram gives you the layout of the entire Sistine Chapel ceiling and tells you what each one of the panels represents and who the main characters are within them. We can definitely see, though, that this fresco technique continues from the Renaissance. Michelangelo's working 1400s and early 15s into the next century, the late 1500s and early 16s, in what we call the Baroque. We start seeing ceiling paintings. This is obviously based on what Michelangelo did in terms of individual panels, but now those panels are painted to look like they have actual frames. There's much more elaborate illusion in terms of these carved architectural, sculptural elements. It's a really interesting case of trying to take what another artist has done and go further. By the end of the Rococo period, and in the 1600s, we're seeing these paintings. I misspoke. By the end of the Baroque period, the 1600s, we start to see paintings that have the illusion that there is no ceiling at all. Instead of illusionistic paintings in frames, it is painted to look as if there is no ceiling, and these characters of angels and saints being carried directly up to heaven above. So there are even marked areas on the floors of these chapels to show you exactly where to stand so that the illusion is absolutely perfect. You can see then how Michelangelo's original idea gets elaborated in the early Baroque and becomes even more elaborate by the late Baroque. So this is a great example of artists kind of playing off of what other people have done in earlier generations. Looking at tempera on panel, because generally speaking, tempera works best on a rigid support. The Italians definitely preferred painting in tempera the Renaissance, the 1400s. And you can see here a couple examples of tempera paintings from the early Renaissance to the mid-Renaissance. It definitely became a popular material in the United States in the 20th century. This is the work of an artist who's a member of the Harlem Renaissance, a period during which a great number of artists rose to prominence in Harlem, roughly the 1920s to the 1940s. This is the work of Jacob Lawrence, and he created a tempera painting series. These panels depict events in what was known as the migration. It was African Americans leaving southern cities and states and moving to northern cities and states in the search of better jobs, better opportunities. And it didn't, of course, always go perfectly. There were plenty of hardships along the way, but this is a pretty remarkable series of paintings that depicts a very important moment in the history of African Americans as citizens in this country. And you can see that he has simplified the forms so that rather than be a specific portrait of one individual worker, this figure here seems to kind of represent multiple people who performed this type of. The oil paint, though, does give us a much broader range of options than tempera. Tempera can look quite flat. Both the Renaissance examples I showed you and the Jacob Lawrence paintings tended to have a little bit flatter appearance than what you're seeing here. The oil paint was used a little earlier in Northern Renaissance, meaning Europe outside of Italy, and it was adopted by the Italians a little bit later in the Renaissance. But the advantage of oil paint is that it is very slow to dry. Therefore, you can apply some color and come back the next day and find that the paint has not dried, and you can finesse and add highlight and shadow. You can apply it in multiple thin layers or glazes, and it allows a much richer, brighter surface with more nuance, more ability to create a range of highlight and shadow and reflection. What you're seeing here is another painting by an artist we've already looked at, Van Eyck. We looked at his Arnolfini wedding portrait when we talked about needing to understand a culture, to understand its symbolism. So we know that he's really fond of doing lots of small detail. And you can see one of the most remarkable details in this painting. This is an altarpiece, normally would be closed, as you see it here, and then when it opens, the inside of those painted as well, so you can see the hinge kind of here, revealing the painting on the inside. But my favorite part of the painting is on the outside, where the frame itself actually seems to shadows into this space that the announcing angel Gabriel and Mary are sitting in when he tells her that she will become the mother of Jesus. It's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. Another Van Eyck painting that just shows the massive amount of detail that's possible with this material. Oil paint provides a really much broader range of options. This is also oil paint, though, and it looks like it's painted much more thickly, and in fact it is. The French Impressionists are well known for their adoption of small and very visibly evident brushstrokes as opposed to thin layers of glazes. A glaze is really made by taking the oil paint and adding more of the binder, more of the liquid part, more of the linseed oil to thin it out and make it transparent. The French Impressionists tended to work with a thicker paint, less oil added to, and with more evident, obvious dabs and strokes of the brush. And that's what you see here in these paintings by Monet. Also use the paint in an incredibly thick way, and we talked about this in Unit 2 when we talked about texture. Paint can be applied so thickly that it physically has actual texture, and you can see the brush strokes in it very clearly. Obviously, that's the very well-known style of paint that's often so thick that you can even see it almost casting shadows. Certainly, we can even thin paint out in different ways as well. This is another use of oil paint that's been thinned out and then dripped. So the material itself has a really incredible range of possibilities, from this incredible level of detail and glazing to this thicker application of evident brushstroke to this incredibly thick impasto, to being thinned out and applied not with a brush but with a stick dipped into liquid paint and splattered. You can see that the paint itself, oil in particular, is a very diverse or very manipulatable material. It's a material that can be used in a variety of different ways for different effects. So this, of course, is the work of Jackson Pollock, who is well known for these large-scale paintings that are really not trying to depict specific images from the real world, but are rather known as what he called action painting, what we now call abstract expressionism. It's really about the dynamic formal qualities of line and color, and especially in this case, movement. The action that he was after was this dynamic movement across the surface, and that's possible with acrylic paint or oil paint. Here's a use of oil, though, that is astonishing. Just because the abstract expressionist movement happened in the 1950s in this country doesn't mean that that's all that artists do, that they just go slopping paint around. There are plenty of other ways of expressing yourself and of using your materials, and following that abstract expressionist movement of the mid-century, the 1950s, into the 1970s, we had artists who were increasingly interested in using oil paint to make things imitate reality as perfectly as possible, creating what almost look like photographs, as is the case here with the brilliant Audrey Flack. She's known as a photorealist because her paintings look so much like the real world, they look like photographs, and that was done with oil paint. These look like they were made with computer-generated tech, and in fact, these are oil paintings as well. They're specifically made to imitate the appearance of what computer illustration can look like. So you can see that the oil paint is incredibly unique in that it has the ability to replicate a variety of different types of textures, surfaces, and visual effects. So it's a very versatile paint. We often look at traditional painting techniques by looking only at the final product rather than at the process. So I wanted to bring in the idea of a traditional way of applying paint specific to oil. Grisaille, or the grayscale painting. So usually in the use of this technique, you would create your image primarily in black, white, and gray, establishing really just the values, almost like you would in a charcoal or graphite drawing. And once that grayscale or grisaille is established, the color is applied in thin glazed layers, and you see that happening in various stages here to get to the final result. This is an intentionally completed grisaille. The nude at the top was left in this state specifically as a teaching training tool. This is the final version of that image, which would have had a grisaille underneath it, leading to this result. So you can see how effective the use of a thin layer of paint would be on top of this establishment of highlight and shadow in the underpainting of the grisaille. Moving on to watercolor, this paint is really kind of remarkable in that it is primarily done on paper. It is primarily done in layers, and we usually do not use white. The white that you're seeing in these paintings is actually the white of the paint itself. So anywhere that you intend to be white is left unpainted. And most watercolor painters work from light color to darker colors, and they usually work from the background to the foreground. So it is very beautiful in it. It depends on being able to see through one transparent layer of color to another. So it has a kind of immediacy and a freshness that you don't find in other materials. That then is contrasted with this paint type known as gouache. And gouache is chemically the same thing as watercolor. It is a pigment suspended in a mixture, or binder rather, that's a secretion from the acacia plant. It's called gum arabic. That substance becomes hard when it's exposed to air. It liquefies when water is attached to it, becomes workable. The difference between the watercolor and the gouache is that gouache is basically watercolor with chalk added to make it non-transparent. So it looks a little bit more like the effect of tempera paint. By far the most recent new kid on the block, so to speak, paint-wise, is acrylic paint. It's a 20th century invention, began development 1930s and was more widely used by artists by the 1950s. It's had quite a lot of advancement in the last 25 years in this country in particular. The idea of acrylic is kind of interesting in that it is a liquid polymer. It is a plastic with pigment embedded in it. But because it is a polymer, a plastic, it can be applied to a lot of different materials. Paint could be applied to rigid or flexible supports. It can be thinned out to make glazes by adding more of the polymer, more of the acrylic itself. It can be built up in thick layers. It can imitate almost everything that any of the other paints are capable of doing. This might look at first glance like a watercolor painting to you because it seems kind of transparent. We can see through one layer to another. That's because the acrylic paint can be thinned into glazes in a way that's somewhat similar to oil paint. The difference being that acrylic paint is going to dry really fast in comparison to oil. So you have to really know what you're doing and go relatively quickly. This is the work of an amazing female abstract expression painter Helen Frankenthaler, who really pioneered the use of acrylic paints in this country. She thinned her paints out into glazes, and rather than dripping them like Jackson Pollock, she poured them onto surfaces to create what she called stain painting. The color kind of stained into canvas as it spread, as it was poured. I wanted to show you just a couple examples of the use of a different approach to underpainting. I showed you the grisaille in the example of Angres Odalisque. These are some paintings of mine from several years ago in which I'm showing you different layers of finish. The top left image is probably about a third done. The one at the bottom right is just had its first layer really applied. What I normally do is to apply some color theory that we learned in Unit 2. In order to make my colors more intense, I like it bright and low. I always use the opposite or complementary color underneath in order to enhance the color that I'm applying on top. So at one stage in a landscape painting, if I'm going to paint the sky blue, I start by putting a base layer of orange so that when I put the blue on top, it will look that much brighter and more intense. Likewise with the green leaves in the trees, I'm going to paint them red first and then apply green on top of that. So when you see the final version, you can see they really are kind of loud. You see a little bit of that orange showing through in the sky. You can see that here. You can see definitely some of the red showing through the green, which helps intensify that effect there as well.